And this really brought us into the modern age of what I call contemporary homophobia. I call it contemporary homophobia because it's really the first time at the turn of the 20th century that we began to realize that homosexuality existed in real numbers, that there were people who were gay, that were gay for life. This wasn't a choice, that it was just something they are. Sigmund Freud told us how they came to be. And this entered us into a modern age of contemporary homophobia. And I'm going to sort of parse over gay history really quick right now and say that not much changed between the turn of the 20th century and 1969 in the Stonewall Inn in Manhattan. This was a gay bar. It was actually more like a rather queer bar in which there was a sweet little deal set up between the mafia, the New York Police Department, and the gay owners of the club, and that the mafia would extort the gays, the police would come to the club every now and then and beat the gays, and as long as the gays didn't respond, as long as they didn't react, as long as they permitted all this to occur, they would be allowed to continue to have their club in the West Village of New York. Well, one day the gays stood up, and they said enough. They started a 3-day-long riot against the New York City's police department. And it was the riot that was heard around the world for gay rights revolution. Just 1 year later, we had the first gay rights parade. And I want you to understand the importance of a gay rights parade. Because gays and lesbians and other sexual minorities, bisexuals, transsexuals, asexuals, all forms of sexual minorities, we're not born into a social support network. If you're born in a culture as a particular racial minority, you're also automatically born into a family and into a community that can support you through the stigma of being that particular identity. If you're born a woman in a sexist and patriarchal society, there's a good chance you were born to a woman, and you therefore have a built-in, that wasn't funny, you therefore have a built-in social support system. But gays and lesbians and other sexual minorities, we're not born into a social support system. And sadly, all too often, we're born into a family that's opposed to the very nature of who we are. So we must come out of the closet in order to come into a family. So visibility has been crucially important for sexual minority rights. Of course, today, the internet brings us that visibility. This was the first gay rights parade. It was 1970. Gay rights parades grew ever since. And I think it's fair to say that perhaps on average, we gained 1 percentage points in improving social attitudes towards homosexuality between 1970 and about 1988. And this was, we thank the feminists of the 1970s for this, the Gay Liberation Front, but attitudes improved slowly. Things got a whole lot worse real quick. In the era that I call the awful 80s, the era that I grew up in, the era that I had my adolescence in, this was, I now know, the most homophobic and in fact the most homo-hysteric period of both British and American history. The 1980s were the absolute dark ages for gays and lesbians in the Western world for a number of reasons. But before I tell you those reasons, let's just take a look at how much support we lost. This represents 44% of people said that homosexuality should be legal in the United States in about 1985. 56% of people thought that homosexuality should be illegal. 44% thought that homosexuality should be legal. Look at the unbelievable decline in just a year's time, down to 32%. This blip, well, that's when I experienced my adolescence. This blip was caused by a political backlash to the gains of the feminist movements of the 70s. And that political backlash was fueled by a virus. Now, I've done a bit of fancy footwork here to put a HIV/AIDS ribbon on Ronald Reagan, because Ronald Reagan never mentioned the word AIDS until 25,000 Americans had died. Margaret Thatcher supported Section 28, which banned the discussion, the, quote, promotion of homosexuality in British schools. So it was a political backlash. AIDS, well, AIDS had a profound effect on our culture because AIDS did a number of things. One thing that AIDS did was it meant we could no longer deny that a significant proportion of our population was gay? Because a significant proportion of gay men were dying. They were normal American men, normal British men, dying in normal families. They were dying of all faiths and all races and all places. Men were dying. Rock Hudson was dying. Mr. Brady, if you're an American, died of HIV/AIDS. And at one level, this meant that not all gay men looked like Oscar Wilde. That gay men could also look, shall I say, normal. But this sent us into a hysteria. It sent us into a hysteria about showing that we are heterosexual. Because there is one thing that is impossible for a heterosexual, not a gay or lesbian, a heterosexual, a straight identified individual, to do in a homophobic culture. In a homophobic culture, the one thing that a heterosexual cannot do is prove that they are indeed heterosexual. Because of the closet. Because we know that somebody could be lying, hiding, and acting. Somebody could marry a woman and still be closeted. Poor Tom Cruise. He's married to Nicole Kidman, he flies jets and plays volleyball, and yet people still suspect that he might be gay. This type of suspicion means that heterosexual men, particularly, are unable to escape the fact that one wrong action, one misbehavior, one wrong word, and people might think, I wonder if he might really be gay. So that when I stand before you today and say I am a gay man, you have no doubts. Why would he say that? Nobody thinks, I think Eric might really be straight. But straight men don't have that type of privilege. So in the 1980s, when we began to realize that not all gay men looked like Oscar Wilde, it pushed us into a further hypermasculinization. It pushed us into a culture in which, because there was nothing worse than to be thought gay in the 1980s, the stigma was over the top. I heard the word fag at least 50 times a day in high school, by teachers as well. Because there was nobody more demonized than the homosexual. Nobody wanted to be thought gay. So what straight men did was they pushed their behaviors over to look like Rambo instead of Oscar Wilde. They began to value muscularity. They valued war. They valued, movies like Godzilla versus Terminator. Homophobia policed men's lives. This is how homophobia hurts heterosexuals as much as it hurts gays and lesbians. Because in a homophobic culture, what I call a homohysteric culture, where straight men particularly can't prove that they're straight, they have to align their behaviors with orthodox notions of masculinity. So, the rules are this in the 1980s. If you're straight and you're male, you cannot cry, you cannot emote, you cannot show fear, you can't go see a movie that has a feminized theme, you can't wear pink, you can't sit with your legs crossed, you can't carry your body in certain ways, you certainly can't play certain sports. Our lives, even our musical choices and our entertainment choices, everything was policed by homophobia. In the 1980s, we lived in a dichotomized world. There was stuff for boys and there was stuff for girls. And what policed those behaviors was the thought that if you transgressed even just a little bit, maybe you put some hair dye in your hair, put an earring on, boom, you were gay. This is homohysteria. Well, this started to fade. And it really started, I got a little bit off one. In this period where men want to be so macho, we found more reason to value sport, particularly invasion sports, rugby, football, particularly American football. But it was also during the 1980s that we started to introduce women to sport. Now, women, of course, weren't allowed to play football without being lesbianized. We had proper sports for women. And of course, I say that facetiously, or sarcastically, I should say. But by the 1980s, we started to believe that sport could do more for us than just make us heterosexual. We started to believe that sport could install morality, character, dedication. We believed that the dedication it took to excel on the athletics field would also equally apply in the classroom, and that sort of the values you learned in one arena would transfer to another arena. So sport became something everybody played, as best exemplified by The Simpsons.
Sports, it's a very small part of life.
Sports. March, Bart rides up in the front seat today because he's a good guy at sports.
Everybody valued sports in the 1980s, and sport was used to create what I call a masculine hierarchy. If anybody is a fan of perhaps Glee, you'll see some remnants of this. Anybody who's watched any movie about American high schools ever, you'll know this, that there was a masculine hierarchy in the 1980s, and at the top of that hierarchy was the team sport athlete. And what was unique about this hierarchy is that a theorist by the name of Connell says that that hierarchy was hegemonic. So that not only did the hierarchy exist, with complicit, marginalized, and gay men, and those who enjoyed things like ballet or theater at the very bottom, but most everybody was looking up the hierarchy, wanting to make it to the top. And if you weren't endowed with the physical abilities to be a football player, you at least became a football fan. Or you could associate with the glory of the idealized masculinity, and you could suck off of their masculine vapors. You could be one of the boys. So if you weren't on the fields, you were in the pubs, drinking the beers, talking about sport. Everybody valorized the individual at the top. And the further you were from the top, the more gay suspicion fell onto you. This was an awful hierarchy. Exemplified by another one of my famous philosophers, Homer Simpson, as opposed to Marge Simpson.
Nerd!
Homer, that isn't very nice.
Marge, try to understand. There are two kinds of college students, jocks and nerds. As a jock, it is my duty to give nerds a hard time. Hey, pal, did you get a load of the nerd?
Pardon me?
Now, of course, I love this clip because Homer Simpson is not a jock in any capacity. I mean, clearly he's not a jock. But he believes he's a jock. He associates with jocks. He doesn't care about how he dresses or how his wife even feels. These were all attitudes that were associated with that esteemed form of masculinity. All of this began to change in about 1992.